I'm Krista McAllister. Hello and welcome to Serious Leadership. Whether you are growing your business or another area of your life into what you want it to be, I welcome you today. So at Cerius, we work with business owners who usually have some specific preferences. No surprise. They're looking for a certain executive background, and that may range from industry experience to size of company they worked for, titles they've had, and I've always had some hypothesis on where these preferences come from. I'm excited to have our guest today, Matthew Cahill, founder and CEO of Percipio Company, who can shed some expertise on the topic. Rather than me just guessing, I have no doubt, Matthew, that you will tell me where those are coming from, and maybe give me some recommendations. Like, I don't know. If not, we will all be educated. And I know that you have such deep knowledge in this area. Matthew, welcome.
Thank you, Kristen. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to start right out of the gate here. You have a common saying, which is, if you have a brain, you have a bias. Where does that come from?
My brain. It's a culmination, really. And it's very intentional. So intentional that I trademarked it. And it's the cornerstone. It's the first step of any or all of my consulting engagements. And it's become catchy. Like, it's become even more successful than what I had thought it would be. Because now in different professional contexts, I'm the bias guy. Or like, people, there's no shortage of bias in the world. And now, fortunately, I'm thought of in a positive context as someone that can help make sense out of this crazy world that we live in.
I love that you started there. You're thought of in a positive way, because for so many years, someone says you have a bias. It's almost like putting a label on them where it's been seen in a negative connotation. I think the more education that's out there, more thought leadership like yourself. So if you can maybe shed a little light on maybe some foundation or definition on the perception of bias, what it is, and maybe some common scenarios that we're seeing it in.
Absolutely. The first step in understanding our own biases is recognizing there's different types of bias. There's cognitive biases, which are a byproduct of how our brains process information, and they don't discriminate. It doesn't matter if you're a woman with blonde hair and a certain age. It doesn't matter if you're a black man, who's just starting out in his career. It doesn't matter if you're a Jewish lawyer or a baker doesn't matter. Like, if you have a brain, you have bias. And there's lots of research that shows this area of cognitive science has led to new disciplines, behavioral economics, advances in neuroscience, social psychology, various interdisciplinary fields. It's really fascinating when you start to approach it through that lens, because you're gaining insight on how your brain works and why you start to understand why people do what they do. And it can not always, but it can lead to deeper discussions about gender, race, culture, age, orientation, religion, politics. Like, these are very deeply personalized, emotionally charged social biases. They're biases related to social constructs. And those conversations can't be held transactionally. They don't usually go well if you think you're going to have like a one and done conversation around something like that.
When you talk about, are you distinguishing between, you mentioned cognitive bias and you mentioned social biases. Are those two different types of biases? I just want to make sure I'm clear on this. Okay.
Yeah. And there's a third that I group them in called institutional biases or systemic biases. And institutional biases or systemic biases are the behaviors related to social biases over time, right? They don't happen. We didn't get patriarchy overnight. You don't get matriarchy overnight. You don't get institutionalized biases overnight. That requires behaviors over time that become normalized. And then everybody just assumes that's the way things are. And when bias gets institutionalized, it becomes really hard to dismantle it and to disrupt it.
I want to go through some examples here to make sure that we're clear as you're talking through and possibly giving us some case studies on the cognitive bias, our social biases, which I think are the ones that we're more commonly looking at. And when we say, oh, they're being biased, we've got that negative connotation. But I know that you're looking to it saying, but we've got to be having these conversations and not have it seen as a bad thing or that it's negative. We've got to look at the full impacts. I want to make sure that we're pulling this apart. So let's start with cognitive bias.
Beautiful.
What does that look like?
So the most common of the myriad of cognitive biases, I think, is like me bias. And like me bias is our natural tendency to gravitate towards people like us. And anyone listening right now can just do a quick mental historical account of their timeline and relationships and just see, like, when you're single and young, you're around other single and young people. And then you might get into a relationship, and then you around other people who are also in a relationship, couples and couples, right? And then if it goes on, parents and children, and then age children, and age seems to be a pretty consistent common denominator because we surround ourselves with people who are in the similar age range as we are, or a similar experience. We gravitate towards people like us, right? That's easy to get your head wrapped around. And in most cases, it's relatively harmless. But when you start to build a business or you start to hire based on that one type of unconscious bias, where you start to get more and more of the same types of people in the same role, then you start to get in these weird power dynamics within organizations where certain types of people have all of the executive authority, and then other types of people are doing all of the labor.
And we see that, and we call it, I've always referred affinity. They have similar affinities. And we've, over the years, you kind of talk to a CEO or business owner and say, tell me about individuals you hired. They say, well, it was like I met my best friend in that initial interview. I love them. It was wonderful. I hired them, and 6 months later, it didn't work out. They didn't do anything I needed them to get done. And I think that like me bias is probably in what I do. It's probably one of the most common, I don't even want to say a common bias, but common things that we come across in that. And I'm so curious, is this from the I want to feel safe, and so I'm bringing in people who think like me or that I have affinity similar to me because I want to work around people that I like? Or is it coming from somewhere else of I want people to agree with me?
Yes. I don't think it's an or condition, Kristen. It's an and it's very insidious because it happens when we're not thinking about it. And it happens all the time, every day. If you go into a circumstance, if you go into a cocktail party and you gravitate towards people, there's a familiarity there. And where this is coming from is because we still have these reptilian brains that are always assessing threat. Like, we scan the universe all the time. Our conscious mind may not be doing it, but we're always on alert.
Mhm.
And if that alert mechanism senses something, then it's going to go into a different direction. And it may never even register in our conscious mind that we're avoiding certain types of people, maybe because we just don't know their language, or maybe we're not comfortable enough in that language, or maybe they, are wearing something that we find offensive, or, like, it's not always obvious why we do what we do. But then the other bias kicks in, and we just like to rationalize our irrational behavior.
It's interesting. The more I think as leaders are, new leaders are coming in, a lot of the executives that we're working with and business owners, we're starting to see a trend of a request saying, I need someone I need to surround myself with diversity of opinion, diversity of thought, people who think differently than me. Are you seeing a trend with that in the workplace or in the leadership? We're seeing it more small to mid-size businesses and owners, founders they really want to be questioned more, and they're figuring maybe I need more diversity of thought. Is that along the lines of that cognitive theory?
Absolutely. And you are talking theory. I want to latch on to the last word that you just said. These aren't absolutes that we're talking about. I think from my perspective, like me bias is a strength. It's a fundamental strength when you are starting your business. What people fail to realize is that there's a limited ramp, there's an expiration date to when that like me bias is still going to continue to be a strength. And so you do need to diversify. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a homogenous group of people. You get a lot of groupthink. You get a lot of people who are afraid to say no. They're afraid to question. They're afraid of conflict. And, that's rarely a recipe for anything successful.
I'm sure there's some other common biases that you see in the workplace. You work with a lot of companies and uh, walk them through recognizing here are the biases, most common biases, the impact it's having, and what can happen when we address them. There's a lot to unpack there. So I want to stay on the identifying some of those biases in the workplace and kind of that awareness of what are the types of biases and what impact is it having.
Well, the last time I checked, there's about 180 to 200 different named cognitive biases with associated research from different domains. And a lot of them candidly overlap one another. And it's not an exact science. This is all burgeoning new territory for neuroscientists, because now they can see what areas of the brain are lighting up under certain conditions and then extrapolate some meaning out of that, which I think in a lot of times that it gets overplayed, like there's some causal nature to it. And you're moving from the subjected sense of interpretation to, something that's just biological in nature, and we don't really understand all that's involved with it. I think in my world, what I've narrowed it down to is 5 that I think are the most common. And like me bias is the first one. Egocentric bias is the second. Availability bias, I call it a bias in this context. Anchoring bias is the fourth, and proximity bias is the fifth. And they form an acronym, LEAAP, LEAP, to allow people to really use these things as lenses so that they can make better decisions for themselves.
I always think one of the first steps in understanding something is being aware of it. And now that you've mentioned all 5 of those, Matthew, I cannot move on until we talk through each and every one of them. Otherwise, I'm not going to be able to sleep. I'm going to go, I want to know what anchoring bias is, my curiosity. So if you don't want humor me, I'd love to just talk through each one of those so that we've at least got the initial awareness, and I can certainly dive in and do more research to any one of them after our discussion. If I want to learn more, I can, I can have additional discussions, reach out. We've talked about like me. Tell me about egocentric, because I automatically want to go to, oh, well, that's easy. Someone's got an ego.
That's a part of it for sure. How I define egocentric bias is my views are clear to everyone and true. And so when you are engaging in egocentric bias, it's very common, by the way, in lawyers, doctors, people named Kristen McAllister, anybody that's had a measure of success in their life. Because you need to have that, right? You need to have that kind of clarity on who you are, what you're doing, and how you're going about doing it. So I want to say this again, just like me bias, it's not innately a bad thing. Egocentric bias is actually a sign of strength in certain contexts. What happens is when you're in those positions where you're making decisions on behalf of other people, you start to forget that not everybody has that same level of understanding that you do in your area of expertise. And when you forget that, you start to be a worse communicator, right? Sometimes people who are in positions of power and authority forget how much influence they have. And they could just be sitting in a room and it just changes the way people are going to experience and hear things, right? And if they say even that, you know, they put something out there, it's heard differently by other people around them. And a result of this, a byproduct of this, a lot of times is intimidation. Like you just come across as being very intimidating. And then, you know, you have people who are just sitting on their hands. They're not raising their hands anymore. They're not bringing forth their best selves and their best ideas. And that's not a sign of behaviors that you want in your organization.
So I'm not saying that I have the egocentric bias.
Of course you do.
If I did, I was going to say, don't ask anyone on my team. They're going to raise their hand and say, absolutely no question about it. She loses us every other sentence. From someone who, now that I'm aware of that, how would I go about, I've got the awareness, I want to take a step towards working on that or improving. Am I working on my communication, or am I working on how I'm communicating or interacting with others?
Both. I think that the mitigation strategy for egocentric bias, and by the way, Kristen, I have an assessment where I have thousands. I have between 5,000 and 6,000 people that have taken this assessment, and lawyers, doctors, you know, people who have achieved measures of success, they score the highest in egocentric bias versus all of the others. So you're not alone. And
No doubt.
I think that you know, the first step is to a mitigation strategy is to really get other perspectives, meaning like you have to listen more and talk less, and really allow your people, your trusted circle, you have to give them permission to question and to bring out, you know, where they're coming from, even if it's not something you want to hear, right? That's the catch, right? And this isn't to say that you're going to do this 100% of the time, all the time, right? Because then you'd never get much of anything done. But as a leader, you really need to be mindful of this, because if you start to notice some of these other dynamics in your group where things aren't working as smoothly as you think they ought to be, then I think egocentric bias is a worthy one to explore in inviting people to, you know, to reflect it back to you, because chances are you're actively engaged in it and you're not aware of it.
That's where that active listening can come in. What did you hear? What's your understanding, and what are your observations? And coming, I love the questions. This is fascinating. I want to take time, but I'm dying to get to some of these others. I'm just fascinated. You can start to see all the different companies, the roles, the people you've worked with. And I think I love your quiz that you can recognize what are some of my biases. You can start to take guesses of others and understand this is probably why I'm challenged working in this situation versus that situation. And so I'm intrigued as to what the rest of them are and how we can each use that towards having better working relationships. I think availability is the next one.
So availability, in some schools of thought, in some research discipline, this is actually called a heuristic, the availability heuristic. And heuristic is, it's not a word many people are common, or it's not familiar to many people, so I tend to stay away from it. But a heuristic is just one of the ways our brains process information. And availability bias is our bias towards the most easily accessible ideas, or the easiest to access bits of information. One of the more common examples of this is confirmation bias. When you learn about confirmation bias, it's when you're coming into a situation with a preconceived idea, And then your brain automatically fills in the gaps with the easiest to access information. And you can see this, it's very evident in headlines. When you read a headline, it's written with a certain amount of confirmation bias. Everything that we consume in our digital landscape is written with some type of confirmation bias and then banking on you just filling in the gaps with the available information.
I can see that coming into play. Everything from buying a car because that's the car I'm familiar with and that's the brand that I've got history with, to picking a technology. Well, I worked with this technology at my last role. I'm familiar with it. I know the rep. It's easy. It may not be the best fit for this situation,
Right.
but I've got everything I need to know about it right there at the top of my head.
Yep. You got it.
So I love your word mitigate. As this is, especially comfort, we talk about comfort zones. This is the ultimate comfort zone, is the availability. I'm going to go with the easiest, the path of least resistance. How am I going about mitigating that from, I get that's the easiest, but I'm biased towards that for a reason because I know and it's familiar with it. What would be your recommendation to start to ease towards gathering all information first?
You just stated it. That's the mitigation strategy, is consider as much information as possible and not just accept that path of least resistance or the one that's most comfortable, right? That's the other factor that comes into play that really excites availability bias, is that there's a comfort in feeling we know something. And when you really get into studying logic or rational thought, you quickly realize we don't know anything. Like everything is it's very, very subjective reality. We don't really take a lot of time to question it because we're all too busy. And it serves us really well. I mean, I think availability bias is how we make 99% of the just simple choices throughout the day. You're just hungry, so you go for something, and then you might be presented with some options and you just grab something. It's not really like there's a science to it or a logic to it. Logic is very different. That requires a lot of mental effort. And availability bias is also an over-reliance on our default programming, on our habits, and the things that we do without thinking about it.
Which I can imagine. Maybe that's where that saying comes from when you're working with companies on productivity. But that's the way we've always done it.
Yeah,
It's really tough to do it differently.
It's actually great you brought that up because that's such a common response. And whenever you hear that, it's a pretty good bet. It's an indicator that something needs to change.
Which is tough because we all have our comfort level. But I appreciate knowing that this is normal, it is typical. It's a cognitive bias that so many of us, if someone doesn't have it, I'd like to meet them. That would be fascinating conversation.
You know what, Kristen, they probably don't have a head. Like they'd be no brain, no bias. That's the only way to get to no bias.
I love it. So now looking at anchoring bias. I can tell this is an interesting one.
It sure is. Anchoring bias is our brain's innate preference for the first, right? The first number, the first graph, the first image, and that then shapes the rest of the story. So our brains get anchored on that first. Anchoring bias is the reason there's a power in a first impression. So anchoring bias, it's used intentionally by salespeople to anchor. They lead with a bid, and then they know they can come down a little bit, but they anchor the conversation in a higher amount. And then, the person who's being anchored feels like they're getting a good deal, but the salesperson knew all along they could go down 10% or 20% or whatever it is. And so anchoring bias it's a more intentional bias that can be somewhat manipulated, and it is manipulated all the time.
Is that where you look at when you do a presentation, you lead with, here's what I'm going to tell you, you end with it at recency versus the primary thing you have versus the last thing that you heard. Is there a balance in that in the anchoring bias, or is it no, what you heard first, that's in what you're comparing everything else to?
Yeah, it's more of the latter. I mean, for it to be anchoring bias, it really needs to serve that purpose. So it's framing the rest of the story. And we do that all the time. Lawyers, it's one of the reasons why a lawyer would want to go first, or depending on the case, because they want to anchor a certain idea in the jury's mind. It's also the premise behind advertising and the use of imagery in this thing called advertising is built on anchoring bias. And initially, with just some exposure, it might not be that bad. But given that we've had decades of repeated exposure to certain images, think about how that shapes the perception of women, or the perception of men, or the perception of, like status. I mean, it's anchoring bias is the reason that companies spend billions of dollars on a brand, because it works, because our brains, we get repeated images of a Nike swoosh, for example, so much so that now when you see the Nike swoosh, it just elicits an emotional response that's usually something positive, because it's just been reinforced by superstar athletes, by these great music, by these great sounds, and so it's really pernicious is what anchoring bias is. It's universal. It's all over the place. And it has some, harmful effects over time.
I think a check mark, you think Nike. It's so much money has been spent on it and put it in front. And I know I'm treated because I hear the anchoring bias, I pair it with the egocentric bias, and I think, wow, if as a leader I'm the first one to say something in a meeting, and then I try and follow it up with, so what do you think? I just nullified me asking the question.
Yeah, if there is a best practice in those situations, I tell leaders, the CEO or anybody that's the perceived, whoever has the most authority in that context, if you're wanting it to be an intellectual exercise, you speak last. Don't share your idea first, because it's going to shape and anchor everybody else's opinion and their ability to share their opinion. If you want to have a more emotionally open meeting, a more intimate meeting, something where people are going to open up, then you share first. And you share your feeling, and that then anchors everybody and tells everybody it's okay.
That sets the tone.
Absolutely.
This is fantastic. Okay. So many questions beyond this. I want to make sure we hit on proximity because I want to go there, and then I want to go kind of step into the impact of it and more the emotional tie within organizations and some of the work that you do. I've got to hit the fifth on proximity.
So proximity bias, as it sounds, we overvalue that which is closest to us in close proximity. That's, I think, just a biological product. Like we grow up in these small little units called families, and that's where we learn how to love and how to be of value and how to be valued and how we're seen, heard. Everything comes from that close proximity. For years, that's just how we designed and organized this thing called work. Right? We organize not only work, but like society built around this notion that you have home and then you have office, and you had this thing called a commute. And that was in the BC era. That was in 2019 BC, before COVID. We now live in a different era. And proximity bias it's become more, I think, detrimental because we still think in binary terms. We're either, close or far. We're either on or off. We're either this or that, or we're male or female. Like there's so many different binaries that we live in a world that is incredibly non-binary. Like there's so many different gradations to things. There's so many different nuances to things. And our brains are working overdrive to try to get caught up on that. And when it comes to proximity bias, when you and I finish this recording, we finish this session, 6 months from now, you and I may be somewhere in a, at a park or in a meeting, in a conference room or wherever, and our brains will have no recollection of whether or not this conversation took place in person or whether or not it took place through this magic of this virtual world that we find ourselves in. And so I think with proximity bias, the real trick is to remove distance from the equation. And when you do that, you're able to create incredible engagements, whether they be in person or through some type of digital medium or digital tool or video conference or whatever it might be. I mean, I think it's you have to override that initial instinct that we must be in close proximity in order for it to have value.
That's quite an explosive topic right now in can workers continue to be remote, hybrid, what's most productive, what works for my organization, my culture. And I think it's going to continue to heat up versus just go away. Certainly as you have a new generation in the workforce. I'm curious from your take, and especially some of the companies that you've worked with, when you look at the future of work, what is your recommendation or what do you work through with them to, I don't want to say mitigate this bias because I think there's so many things surrounding it and other biases, other situations that are coming in that are playing a role in it. What's a discussion that you talk companies through to help them figure out, is this a bias that's serving you or something else?
Yeah, it's really hard to isolate any one of these biases. First of all, let me just say that. Like I present them as five unique, distinct things, but more often than not, they're overlapping. They're not mutually exclusive. They can all happen in one moment, right? Or like in one exchange. But to the best of your ability to really focus in on proximity bias, it's imperative because it will be driving your decisions around policies, around employee engagement, around what to spend money on, where to travel. Like there's so many other implications that come along with proximity bias. It influences all these different areas. And the best practice that I've been coaching any leader that will listen over the last 5 years is allow the nature of the work to determine where it gets done. It makes no sense to force somebody into an office only to have them sit at a machine that they're going to join somebody that's not in that office for the meeting. Like that doesn't make any sense. It's still grounded in this very anachronistic idea that I need to see you to control you or to monitor you or to police you or whatever. Or you're not going to be productive unless you're there, right? Like it's when you start to peel away and examine like what are the underlying assumptions that are being made here, you don't have to go very far to realize that you're allowing proximity bias to erode trust in your organization.
I love it's so impactful in so many ways, which leads me to the next thing. But before I go there, I want to look at you said the nature of work and how you coach individuals. How do you help them think through? Is it the nature of the work that they're being tasked to, or the nature of the work for the outcome that the organization is looking for? Because we talk about, you and I have had this conversation on the future of work and where we see that going. And there's inputs versus outputs. And we don't need to define exactly how the input should be. We just need to get clarity on the output.
And I think we're getting better at writing goals, for example, that are more output oriented and allowing people the freedom to figure out how to get there. Uh, but that's still relatively new. Like, how many organizations really are good at defining SMART goals, for example? Not many that I'm working with. They still
Music
subject
leaders.
themselves to these very anachronistic ideas about what productivity is, or what their, what to prioritize in their own organization.
And you've talked about when you look at some biases, and obviously we're just hitting on the cognitive. You talk about social biases, which then lead to a lot of the institutional biases, and none of these are discrete in their own separate. It is all intermixed and intertwined. What do you see inside of organizations when you look at productivity and how we can use this to not just impact the business, but impact the people in it? Because I love your phrase from bias to belonging. You missed your calling in marketing, Matthew. You really come up with these great couple of words that say 1,000 words in it. I'll help you. You can be my new communication coach here. How are you in being aware of these biases? Are we then taking action and we're mitigating? Because there's so much going on with this. The Gallup poll, their famous question, I would best find the workplace. I want to work around people that I enjoy. I want to be somewhere that I belong.
Well, from bias to belonging, that's the umbrella, that's the trajectory of any and every consulting engagement that I embark upon. It's a process. Bias gives us a language that we can use. It gives us some mental lenses, some cognitive tools to then start to change our behaviors. And that's how we start to dismantle the systemic bias, right? But it's the visual is a bias ecosystem, right? It's looking at an organization, any company, any entity is itself an ecosystem. And I call this the bias ecosystem. And you start with cognitive biases, and now you can start to see how they manifest themselves in certain behaviors. And it's the behaviors that are the best measurement for things like gender bias, racial bias, cultural bias, bias related to age, any of those other types of social constructs. Actions and behaviors are the best measurements for those, not necessarily thoughts. And that's where we get a distinction. A lot of times there's tension created because people are wanting to have a conversation about a cognitive bias, but you may be perceiving it as a conversation around a social bias, and now all of a sudden you're triggered, and this isn't going to go anywhere fast. And so I think using bias as a constructive language, as a linguistic construct, taking the time necessary to unpack the emotions that are often wrapped up in a lot of the behaviors, if the behaviors have been present, then we can look to really cultivate space. We can cultivate the way that we gather together to get things done, right? And so much of the work that's done today isn't necessarily time bound. It's not necessarily it's it's not necessarily movement oriented even, right? It's not an assembly line. We're not like mass producing things in most businesses. Most businesses is about collaboration, problem solving, interpersonal relationships, and how do you strengthen those relationships? And when you have, when you put the focus there, now we can really, we can make the type of procedural changes in some cases, process changes in other cases. We can set up different meeting protocols so that we're really going to be favoring and valuing emotional and psychological safety. And now we can really get this ecosystem fostering different types of cognitive biases that are going to, bring people together.
It's interesting you talk about collaboration, because that is coming up in just about every conversation, and seeing a shift from, used to be you're either an individual contributor or you're a manager, and those were your two paths. You were a subject matter expert or you were managing the subject matter experts. And now we're seeing more of a shift towards, you may be an individual contributor, but you're part of a team. And the team has goals, and you work together and you leverage each other. And I can see that more and more as we're needing to socially and cognitively work on a team sport versus an individual sport. How having this conversation can help.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think because the United States of America is such an individualistic country that it makes sense in the workplace to start with identity and who you are in your role in an organization. And those are the two cornerstones for a culture of belonging. So you have identity, but you not only have your individual identity, you also have a group identity. Like, who are you in the context of this team within a larger organization? And so when you start there, right, that gives you room to grow, not only as a person, but as a member of this greater good, this greater collective, which is part of a greater collective called, the business or the organization. And walking through these different cornerstones, there's four that I identify as necessary for a culture of belonging. And identity is the first one.
And now I've got it from being in the talent industry. As I'm onboarding, one of the biggest things is, how do I get employees engaged? How do I get team members engaged? That employee engagement, I feel like, and their connectivity to other people on the team and their connectivity to the organization, like, that's almost the foundation of just about anything that happens after that. As a leader, am I helping them identify who they are in the organization, what their contribution is, or is that something that I need to give them the space to identify and own?
I think it's both. I think companies that have been really successful at this are companies like Google or Facebook, where they get their employees identifying as Googlers or Facebookers or whatever it might be. I mean, they you can hear it in how a person responds to that question at a cocktail party. What do you do? Like, how often does that come up? What do you do? And somebody that really identifies with, who they are in the context of their job doesn't hesitate. They say, like, I'm a doctor, or I'm a lawyer, or I'm a whatever. And how they respond to that question is an indicator of how strongly their identity is tied to whatever it is that they're doing.
I love it. That's a great question to go out and ask your team as to, how would you answer that question?
And the inverse is, if they kind of shy away from it. And I remember I was working at a tech company that was really toxic. I mean, they were awful. And I was there for too long, but I transitioned to this point when people would ask me what I do. I'm like, oh, I work for this software company. And it was just this very vague reference that was just enough to answer the question, but no way did I want to be identified with that company. And I think companies like Wells Fargo, they had, all this craziness in the news and things like that. You still hear people, distance themselves from their employer when that relationship, the employee-employer relationship, this is something that, it irritated me when belonging as a concept came into corporate America, because it wasn't really acknowledging that relationship is such a fundamental dependency, right? Like, your employer is providing you the means for you to have a roof over your head and food in your belly and the ability to provide for your family or whatever, yourself or whoever, your dog or whatever the makeup of your world is. And I think we like to say, oh well, I could leave there anytime I want, so there's no, but it's never that simple, right? And yet that's what the contracts are written. They're written as at will employment, but we layer on these other, kind of, I don't know, sometimes it's justified, sometimes it's unjustified. But if you want to have a culture of belonging, you really need to recognize and appreciate the depth of that relationship.
I don't know if you can have a conversation anymore about what is your culture. I think that's every candidate's question right now. Describe your culture. Tell me about it. That vision, that mission, that why does this company exist? And I think that identity is the why did you choose to work here? Why do you stay here? Having your own why of
Yes.
why I'm here. One of the things I'd love to get into here is, and I know I'm probably opening up a can of worms, but we talk about technology, and technology doesn't have a bias. It programs, it code, it does what we program it and code it to do. But then, as I say, we program it and code it what to do. The fact that I'm the one programming it and coding it, how is that going to impact? Because you've got such a range, even outside of a company or outside of a social construct, going into technology, AI and beyond. What are some of those conversations that you're having with companies to just start the level of awareness? Because this is how we're getting and receiving information and then pushing out on behalf of the company or behalf of ours. It's just listening to you. I don't even know where to start with this.
Yeah, I don't like to open up a can of worms unless I can put the worms back in before we're done. And there's no way we could do this topic justice, uh, other than to say I didn't necessarily want to get into consulting around artificial intelligence, but I was pulled into it by my clients, partly because of how biased every tool that's on the market right now is, from ChatGPT to Gemini to DALL-E to image generators. We're going to have video creation systems soon that will be indistinguishable from, like live recordings of human beings. I mean, we are truly embarking upon a world that we've never chartered before. And our reptilian brains, that's how we think, most of the time, are ill-equipped. It's hard to even imagine what a world is going to be like once these tools become truly integrated and normalized into our everyday routines. They become the subroutines, right? They already are. So you think about what these tools are. In one way, they are our brain. If we have this unconscious area of mental processing, this biased area, that's the birthplace of bias, is our unconscious mind. These types of tools are sort of taking those unconscious mental processes and these subroutines and making them routines that you can ask prompts to. And they do it now faster than our own brains could even produce a 5-paragraph essay, right? You just say, give me a 5-paragraph essay, and this machine can go. You can say, no, write it with a little more nuance and write it with this kind of emotion and write it with, and if you get the prompts right, you can have it do 80 to 90% of a typical job that you would have had to do from scratch. How do you even envision a world that can upend so much of what we used to do, other than to know that we have insatiable appetites for lots of things. And if we can start to shift the things that we have insatiable appetites for to things that it doesn't matter if we just consume more and more and more of them, maybe in a weird way, we can start to shift our actions and behaviors from less doing, more inadvertent damage, climate change, greenhouse gas, heating oceans, whatever it might be, maybe we can start to collectively shift and, focus that insatiable appetite towards a greater good. Long-winded, crazy soapbox
No,
tangent.
not at all. I love, because, and I wanted just to hit on it to open up, start those conversations, start opening up those conversations. There's certainly a lot of them going on in the schools. I've had a lot of them in CEO circles, good, bad, ugly. And it's gone from worried and scared about it to adopting as part of daily lives in a fairly exponentially fast way, to where the conversation went, should we be worried about it, to how quickly can we adopt this. As you look at some of our discussions here and other things that in working with companies, I just love to part with a couple pieces of advice that you would give leaders of today and the leaders of tomorrow, as we're shaping them right now, to what they can do, where's their ownership piece, or what should they be aware of as they come across these, or as they are thinking about, how can I make the world better? How can I make the workplace better?
Well, I said I was pulled into these conversations with my clients around how to best use generative AI tools. And my approach is to first mitigate the bias that's in the data set, in the LLM, in the algorithm, in the tool selection, even the bias that's in your thinking, to go from one end of like, I don't want to deal with it, to like, how can I adopt it? There's a lot of bias even in that decision, because now if they've swung that far, they're being fueled by FOMO, right? Their fear of missing out on something. And I think it's imperative to step back and recognize we're leaving the digital age. I mean, it seems like we just got here, but we're leaving the digital age and we're moving into the knowledge era. And the knowledge era is focused less on the big why, like the Simon Sinek thing, and much more on how we show up, how we engage, how we get work done, how we handle conflicts. Like that's the area that we're awful at. We're really bad at the how, because we haven't had to focus on it. We've been so preoccupied with the who, what, where, and then the why for 40 years. And now it's a convergence of tools, of technology, of evolution of technology, where the how really matters. And so for leaders, if there's one thing that you can start to focus on, is not necessarily overhauling everything in your business, but rather just start to look at it through that lens, right? Like from my perspective, what types of bias led to the decisions? What types of bias may be present in the behaviors and actions? And how did that get baked into my systems and processes and protocols and governance in some cases? So now we can figure out what level do we want to start disrupting, and how are we going to go about that disruption?
I love it. Matthew, thank you so much. I know that we don't always get into the details of implementation, and I think you have 30 steps that you could go through in your process of how to approach it. But what I always appreciate is you get my mind thinking, you get me questioning, and you don't just change. It's not just a, how am I thinking, how am I feeling? And that is what I always enjoy in our conversations, and hopefully others will get out of it. Thank you so much for joining me today, Matthew, on Serious Leadership. And until next time, have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Kristen. It's been a joy.